Good things come in small packages. Despite Ant-Man's rise in popularity thanks to the MCU, people still underestimate the little guy for his seemingly silly shrinking ability. But Ant-Man has the potential to be quite powerful. And not just because of the Up Thanos' butt meme. Whether we're talking about the many other characters taking Hank Pym's place as the resident side-shifting superhero or one of their many alternate universe equivalents, Ant-Man is always a force to be reckoned with. So let's dig some of the craziest, most powerful Ant-Man variants we know of out of the anthill. Okay, so if you're here watching this video, you're an MCU fan. And if you're an MCU fan, you're used to Scott Lang as the main Ant-Man, with super scientist Hank Pym providing all the tech that gives him his amazing size-changing abilities. Now, that's all well and good. However, Scott is actually a bit more distinct from Hank in the comics outside of just being some smarter-leg former thief. He has actually figured out a few kinks to the Pym particles that even Hank himself never considered. You know that whole thing about how Ant-Man hits like a normal-sized person even at small sizes? Well, it turns out that this is because the Pym particles are actually capable of altering a person's strength even at regular size, which is something that Scott figured out himself during a battle against Dr. Doom. On top of that, in the comics, Scott's ability to change the size of other objects doesn't actually come from those little Pym particle grenades that Hank made for him. Instead, that's Scott himself being able to mentally manipulate the quantum field that Pym particles generate on the fly. Remember, Scott may not be a super scientist like Hank, and he might be a bit more of a goofball, but he's definitely not stupid and he is not incompetent. With how much talk there's been about them lately, there's a pretty good chance that you're already well aware that, in the comics, Scott's daughter Cassie eventually joins the Young Avengers as the size-changing superheroine Stature. But while her abilities may be similar to the Ant-Men that came before her, she's a bit different from them. For one, Cassie's size-changing abilities are actually her own. Due to willfully exposing herself to Pym particles for several years, Cassie can change her size without having to rely on any equipment to do so. And as a result, her abilities work slightly differently. For an example, she seems to be limited to just how big she can grow, with approximately 250 feet being her limit and larger sizes being harder for her to sustain for very long. To add on to this, her emotions can affect her size, like growing larger when she gets angry or shorter when she gets sad, so she needs to keep her feelings in check. Later on in her superhero career, when she went from calling herself Stature to Stinger, she also gained more Ant-Man and Wasp-esque equipment. This includes a pair of wings and a helmet that lets her talk to insects. Yep, she is really taking after her old man. The Ultimate line of Marvel comics, which were originally created to give new readers a fresh starting point, is especially famous for two things. One is for actually killing off its universe's version of Peter Parker and instead introducing us to Miles Morales. The other is just how much of a mess the Ultimates became. To cut a long story short, the Ultimate take on the Avengers attempted to reimagine the superheroes in a more realistic and dark light, which, while initially quite well received, very quickly devolved into turning the whole team into much bigger jerks than they normally are. You know that "you think the letter on my head stands for France" panel everyone loves to meme on? Yeah, this is where that's from. And boy, Hank in particular really got hit bad. He had considerably less moral concerns about his work, and he was willing to do absolutely terrible things to people if it meant increasing the scope of his own powers. In fact, in this setting, that's how he got his powers in the first place, by experimenting on and reverse engineering his wife Janet's shrinking powers to give himself giant powers. Oh, and did I mention that he physically abused her, tried to kill her, and eventually betrayed the whole team just because he didn't think people were stroking his ego enough? So yeah, Ultimate Hank may be powerful, but he's also a complete asshole. Tony Stark, weapons manufacturer, billionaire playboy, and one of the Marvel Universe's greatest heroes, Ant-Man. Wait, what? No, it's true. Tony Stark is Ant-Man. In an alternate universe, that is. Sometime in the past, the Earth 818 version of the Red Skull managed to get his hands on and bond with the Venom symbiote. Now calling himself the Black Skull, he then gathered a group called the Multiversal Masters of Evil, who quickly conquered the world. Later, a young Tony Stark began obsessing over sciences of the past, and he eventually came upon the decapitated head of a Celestial, which he soon began to study. From this, he discovered the Stark particles that allowed him to change his size at will and became the resistance fighter Ant-Man. And then he teamed up with Wonder Man, Moon Knight, Vision, and Infinity Thing to wrestle control of the world away from the Black Skull. This version of Tony is still every bit the tech genius, not content with just owning a suit that can change size. He carries an impressive arsenal of shrunken down weapons for one thing, and the star of this artillery has got to be his Nowhere gun, a powerful energy blaster that he built from the same severed Celestial head that he used to create the Stark particles in the first place. You might be aware that the movie Logan from a few years ago was actually based on a rather popular comic story arc known simply as Old Man Logan. In this bad future, the various supervillains of the Marvel Universe had managed to conquer the United States and split it up between themselves into territories that they could reign over, with the surviving elderly superheroes, and in some cases their children, doing their best to help those trying to make a living in the hellhole the world has become. This setting has an all-new Ant-Man in Dwight Barrett, a child genius hanging out with Old Man Hawkeye in the Bishop Refuge, who managed to rebuild an old Ant-Man helmet he'd been given at the tender age of 8. He didn't exactly use it for heroics very much though. In the harsh wastelands, he used this to demand a toll for anyone wanting to cross a bridge he'd claimed, lest they get instantly eaten by a swarm of ants. That is one scary kid. One of the most well-known tropes in comic books has got to be the alternate universe evil counterpart. It's practically a rite of passage for a superhero, to the point where I bet they bully the heroes that don't have one. And of course, the Ant-Men are no exception. In fact, Scott has not one, but 2 evil counterparts from other worlds, with the first one of them being called Fire Ant. This version of Scott Lang comes from a world where the Squadron Supreme, a super team that Marvel created as pastiches of DC's Justice League, were the biggest superhero team on Earth, although the various Marvel characters still existed within it. Here, Scott never reformed from his criminal ways and only got worse over time. In fact, he eventually joined Baron Zemo in his Siege Society, which attempted to assist Hydra in taking over Europe in the wake of the Squadron Supreme's own take on the superhero civil war. Infiltrating the Squadron's base, Fire Ant then fought against Tom Thumb, who was the Squadron Supreme's version of DC's The Atom, and later assisted his teammate Hawkeye in defeating the Blue Eagle, who was their take on Hawkman. So there you have it. Evil alternate Scott Lang kind of beat up 2 members of the Justice League. Not too shabby. That last evil version of Scott never actually faced the main Ant-Man, and neither did the one I'm about to talk about. But he did end up fighting Cassie Lang. Well, the version of Cassie Lang known as Stinger, who comes from the MC2 universe anyway. Can you guys keep up with all these ant people? Cause it's starting to get really hard for me to keep track of them. Anyway, this version of Scott came from Earth 9907, where the Red Skull won World War II and the world was now led by none other than Victor Von Doom. And if you thought the last evil Scott was bad, then you don't want to know about this guy. Working for Dr. Doom under the codename Pincer, this Scott murdered his own daughter Cassandra after she refused to serve Doom, and was generally a sadistic and violent maniac. When the MC2 Avengers, of which Cassie was a member, then crossed over into this world, Scott took special delight in getting to kill his daughter a second time. But this time Cassie was ready and managed to defeat him. And no doubt needed plenty of therapy for a good long while after. If you think it was selfish of Scott to steal the Ant-Man suit even if he only did so to save his daughter's life in the comics, then oh boy, you're not going to like Eric O Grady. Working as a low-level SHIELD agent tasked with guarding Hank's lab on the helicarrier, Eric originally stole the latest version of the Ant-Man suit and used it to shrink down and hide during a Hydra attack. And then he just kind of decided to keep it. Known as the irredeemable Ant-Man for his selfish personality and his long list of skeevy actions, it took a long time and a lot of prodding from other Avengers for Eric to become a proper hero, who eventually died battling a supervillain group known as the Descendants. However, even though O'Grady started out as a big old jerk, he did have a more advanced version of the suit than normal, and it shows in his list of abilities. Outside of the usual size changing and insect communicating stuff, the suit was equipped with sound amplification so he could actually talk to people properly even when he was shrunken down. He also had a pair of retractable robot limbs similar to the Iron Spider suit that let him climb walls. And finally, his boots were equipped with flame propulsors that allowed him limited flight, but could also be used as flamethrowers. Which our next Ant-Man learned the hard way. You know that Ant-Man suit that O'Grady stole? That was built for someone else, namely the much higher ranked SHIELD agent Mitchell Carson. After realizing that the Ant-Man suit Pym built for him was stolen, Mitch put on an older version of the Ant-Man suit and made it his mission to track down the thief. He eventually caught up to and got into a fight with Eric O Grady, who then proceeded to accidentally burn half of his face off with the rocket thrusters built into his boots. Oops. Don't feel too bad for Mitch just yet though. It turns out he was actually a sadistic serial killer who only became a SHIELD agent in order to have an easier time killing even more people. And believe me, he had every intention of making sure Eric died a slow, painful, and horrible death. And that's exactly what he would have done if Iron Man hadn't shown up in the nick of time. As a former police officer and high-ranking SHIELD agent, Mitch was not just a great combatant, he was also a trained spy, as well as very well trained in the handling of firearms and explosives. Yeah, that's not really a set of abilities you want combined with size changing, even when the guy isn't a complete psycho. But don't think we're done with the mess Eric O Grady made of things just yet. His actions led to the creation of yet another Ant-Man, the Black Ant. In the Marvel Universe, S.H.I.E.L.D. regularly deploys a particular type of android called an LMD, a life model decoy, which are extremely lifelike robots who are usually built for espionage. However, they also tend to get used to covertly replace people that S.H.I.E.L.D. really doesn't want people to know are currently missing or dead, and they have a bad habit of ending up in the hands of villains who use them for their own nefarious purposes. And that's what the Descendants did after Eric died fighting them. They created an LMD of Eric and sent him back to the Avengers to work as a double agent, though he was found out pretty quickly. And while he since then worked with a bunch of villains under the name Black Ant, he actually still has Eric's memories and is clearly hoping to eventually turn back to the side of good. This time with the perks of being a robot on top of all of his Ant-Man abilities. That self-repair function just can't be beat. Remember that alternate universe I mentioned earlier where Tony Stark became Ant-Man? What about an alternate universe where Tony Stark creates Ant-Man? Or at least an imitation of him. On Earth 9997, probably better known as Earth X, the Avengers died fighting the Absorbing Man. Following this, Norman Osborn, who was President of the United States, commissioned Tony Stark to create robot replicas of the team in order to defend the nation from future threats. And sure enough, Tony did exactly that, going so far as to program the various robots with the personalities of the lost heroes, which naturally included Hank Pym. And then all of those Iron Avengers were destroyed by an army led by the supervillain known as Skull. Yeah, life for a superhero on Earth X is kinda rough like that. Shortly after this, Brian Braddock, who was known as King Britain in this reality, decided that he wanted the Iron Avengers for himself and had them rebuilt, though without their original personalities intact this time. And the model that he rebuilt based on the Hank Pym robot was renamed Monolith, which was then used to guard Buckingham Palace and sent out to assist other superheroes, such as the Black Knight. So yep, you wouldn't think it at first glance, but somewhere way back, this scary black and yellow Iron Man looking robot was actually Hank Pym. One of the most popular of Marvel's many alternate universes is no doubt Earth C, the Zombieverse. It's popular enough to get adapted in the current What If series on Disney Plus at least. And why not? The idea of a zombie virus infecting a superhero universe is awesomely insane, even if it does get pretty freaking gross sometimes. And trust me, you haven't seen a zombie virus escalate to quite as crazy levels as the one in Marvel Comics. Here, the zombification spread fast among the superhuman community, creating a veritable horde of superpowered, still fully intelligent zombies who just wanted to eat everybody. And yep, that includes good old Hank. Now try and imagine the surprise on Galactus' face when he came to Earth only to find it swarming with superhero zombies. They responded to his arrival by quickly eating the Silver Surfer, then eating him, and using the power cosmic to gain the ability to teleport all across the universe and eat everything else. Oh yeah, sweet dreams, true believers. So, did you like Werewolf by Night? Then you're gonna love Werewolf Hank Pym. Nope, that's not a joke. It all happened in what has to be one of the craziest comic book crossover events to ever exist. Namely Marvel Zombies vs. Army of Darkness. In this story, the groovy dead-eyed hunter Ash Williams, famous from the Evil Dead horror comedy franchise, found himself dead and sent to heaven. At which point the zombie-infected Sentry suddenly showed up and ended up getting the both of them punted into the Marvel Universe by Uatu the Watcher. Having been given a prophetic warning that the zombie apocalypse was going to happen in this world, Ash attempted to warn the Marvel heroes, but it all fell on deaf ears and, well, hijinks ensued. It was only with the help of a still living Dr. Doom that Ash escaped the Marvel Zombieverse, though he got a few peeks at some other crazy universes through the portal. And who's that we got there? Why yes, that is indeed a giant werewolf Hank. Poor Ash just can't catch a break. Get ready for what might be the most hilarious Ant-Man variant to date. I present to you, Little Monster. This angry little guy came to be when everyone's favorite green-skinned space babe Gamora decided to try and use the Infinity Stones to save Soul World, which is a whole reality existing within the Soul Gem, from a being called Devondra. Her plan to do this is long and complicated, but it basically involved merging one half of the universe with the other, creating a reality called Warp World that had half the population. While I'm sure that Thanos would approve of this, the catch was that each inhabitant was now a combination of two different people. Now, if I tell you that one of these combinations was named Scott Banner, I'm sure you're imagining a Hulk with Ant-Man powers growing to Godzilla size and destroying absolutely everything. And as badass as that would be, the actual result is much funnier. Scott Banner does indeed turn into the Hulk and gets stronger the angrier he gets. But he also gets tinier the angrier he gets. Oh man, now I'm just imagining a green Smurf giving Gargamel the puny god treatment. Somebody call Sony, I need this in theaters yesterday. There are a few moments in the comics that Hank will never hear the end of, and one of them is creating Ultron. You know, the big, scary, omnicidal robot that wants nothing more than to kill every single living thing on the planet and who has been a pain in the Avengers collective backside for about half a century now? Yeah, that Ultron. That was all Hank. Good going, buddy. Well, it's come back to haunt him probably hundreds of times by now, but none was quite as bad as in the Rage of Ultron miniseries when the two were fused together. Hank's size-changing technology is already a lot more impressive than people like to give him credit for, but add Ultron's boatload of abilities to this and you got yourself a real force to be reckoned with. This guy can fly at the speed of sound, has an outer shell made of adamantium, and boasts all sort of energy-based abilities that give him immense offense and defense. It is essentially Ultron taking Hank's corpse for a joyride, and it's every bit as horrifying as it sounds. This is what's so fun about multiverses. You end up meeting the most bonkers versions of already established superheroes. Are there any other heroes you'd want to see crazy variants of? Because believe me, I am all over that. I love this nonsense.